The wind never stopped on this part of the Arkansas. Jonas Kane had learned that in the 3 days it took him to reach this bend in the river. The wind came from the west in the morning, swung north by midday, and settled into a low, steady push against the grass by nightfall. It never rested. Neither, it seemed, did the land ask permission from anyone before doing as it pleased. He stood on the low rise above the water, a supply wagon creaking somewhere behind him on the trail, and looked out at nothing that could be called a town, a road, or even a proper trail marker. Just grass cut short by grazing herds long gone, a river running low and slow between cracked banks, and the wagon ruts of the Santa Fe Trail stretching east and west until the horizon swallowed them both. Most men who freighted supplies out to the fort called this stretch of country worthless, too dry for a farm, too far from anything to be called settled, too flat to hide from weather that came without warning. Jonas Kane had spent 4 years learning that most men were wrong about a great many things. He didn't need the land to be easy. He needed it to be his. By the time the sun dropped behind the hills that evening, he had already decided where the first wall would stand. He was 34 years old. He had no wife, no family waiting on a letter, and no particular reason to believe the winter ahead would be kind to a man building alone. He started digging anyway. Welcome to Wild West life. When most people picture the frontier, they picture gunfights, outlaws, showdowns, men who became legends with a gun in hand. But sometimes a legend is just the first man to show up, the one who dug into ground nobody else had touched yet, and decades later, his name was still the first one people remembered. If stories like that are why you're here, hit subscribe. We tell one every week. This is the story of Jonas Kane. Santa Fe Trail, 1868. No plan beyond the next mile. 3 years before that first wall ever went up, Kane had come to this country the way most men came to it in those years, not chasing gold, not chasing glory, just chasing work. For 3 years he'd hauled freight for the army out of the fort 5 miles east, flour, grain, tools, the occasional crate of ammunition, whatever a post that far from anywhere needed to keep running. It was steady work. It paid. It also meant sleeping on the ground more nights than not, and answering to a quartermaster who changed his orders as often as the weather changed its mind. Somewhere along that trail, he couldn't have said exactly when, Kane had stopped thinking of the freight runs as a job and started thinking of the land itself as something worth looking at twice. The bend in the river was the reason. Most of the country around the fort was as dry as a bone, but here, where the Arkansas curled north before straightening out again, the grass grew thick enough to hold a herd through a season, and the water didn't disappear the way it did further out. Buffalo had grazed it for longer than any man could account for. The wagon trains passing through on the Santa Fe Trail cut close enough to the bend that a man could sell to travelers without ever leaving his own ground. It wasn't paradise. It was practical. That was enough. He filed what claim there was to file, packed what little he owned onto a borrowed wagon, and came back in the spring of 1871 to build. He'd never built anything more permanent than a lean-to before. There wasn't a tree worth the name for 20 miles in any direction. No lumber, no shingles, nothing a man back east would recognize as building material. What there was grass. Thick-rooted prairie sod, cut into blocks with a plow and stacked like brick. Walls 2 feet thick that would hold heat in winter and keep it out in summer if a man built them right. Kane did not build them right the first time. He learned that the hard way, 3 weeks in, when a wall on the north side, the side that would take the worst of the winter wind, buckled after a week of rain turned the mortar mud soft at the base. He'd stacked the blocks too high, too fast, hadn't let the lower courses set before adding weight on top. The whole corner sagged, then came down in the night with a sound like a slow sigh, taking a good week's work with it. He stood over the collapsed corner the next morning, coffee gone cold in his hand, and said nothing to nobody, because there was nobody to say it to. He just started again. Lower courses this time. Wider base. Patience he hadn't known he had until the land taught it to him. By early summer the house stood, 3 rooms, low-roofed, walls thick enough to muffle the wind to a murmur. It wasn't much to look at. It was his. He hadn't built the house to be a stopping place, but the Santa Fe Trail ran close enough to the door that it became one anyway. The first were buffalo hunters, 2 brothers out of Missouri, half-starved and short on water, who saw smoke from Kane's cook fire and rode in asking if they could fill their canteens. Kane gave them water, then coffee, then a place by the fire when it turned out they had nowhere particular to be that night. They talked about the herds further west, how the plains still ran thick with buffalo, if a man knew where to look, how the hide trade was paying better than cattle work these days. Kane listened more than he talked. That had always been his way. But he noticed, after they rode out the next morning, that the house felt different with them gone, quieter than it had been before they arrived, in a way that hadn't bothered him until he had something to compare it to. More came after that. Freighters. A family headed toward New Mexico territory who stopped only long enough to water their stock. A pair of surveyors who spent 2 nights and left behind a bent nail and a half-empty tin of tobacco that Kane found weeks later and never threw away. He didn't mind the company. He minded more how much he'd started to expect it, how the sound of hooves on the trail had become something he listened for without meaning to. The first snow came in November, early and hard, and it took Kane by surprise in a way the land would only let a man be surprised once. He'd read the sky wrong. A high, thin haze he'd taken for nothing turned, by nightfall, into a wall of white moving fast from the northwest. The kind of storm men at the fort had warned him about, and he'd only half believed, the way a man only half believes anything he hasn't lived through yet. He got most of the herd into the low draw behind the house before the worst of it hit. Not all of it. 4 head he never found, not that night, not in the thaw that came weeks later, not ever. He told himself it could have been worse. It didn't make the number easier to sit with. He spent 3 days inside those sod walls while the storm worked itself out, feeding the fire with what dried grass and buffalo chips he had stacked, listening to wind that sounded, at times, like something alive trying to find a way in. He thought, more than once, about the freight wagons back at the fort, about steady pay and a bunk that other men had already built. He thought about it, and he stayed anyway. When the sky cleared, he walked the draw, counting what was left of his herd, and he started paying attention to the wind the way he'd never had to before, which direction it came from before a storm, how the birds went quiet a full day ahead of bad weather, how the cattle themselves would bunch and turn their backs to a coming wind hours before a man could see anything wrong with the sky at all. Nobody taught him that. The winter did. The boy showed up in the spring of 1873, walking, not riding, which told Kane something before the stranger ever said a word. He came down the trail at midday, dust-caked and thin in the way of someone who hadn't eaten regular in a while, no horse, no pack beyond a bedroll slung across his back, and a canteen that rattled empty when he set it down by the well. Kane watched him from the corral fence a good while before the boy noticed he was being watched at all. "You lost?" Kane asked, when the boy finally looked up. "No, sir." A pause, like the boy was deciding how much truth the question was worth. "Just walking till I find somewhere that'll have me." Kane didn't ask where he'd walked from, or why a boy who couldn't have been more than 18 was doing it alone. There wasn't much point. Men and boys ended up on this trail for 100 reasons, and most of the reasons weren't anybody's business but their own. "Name's Silas," the boy offered when the silence stretched long enough to need filling. Silas Boone. Cain. He looked the boy over once, the worn boots, the hands that hadn't done real work in a while, but weren't afraid of it either. You know cattle? Some. My uncle ran a few head back in Missouri before. Silas stopped himself, decided the rest wasn't worth telling. I can learn what I don't know. Cain had run the place alone for 2 years by then. He'd told himself he preferred it that way. No wages to pay, no mouths but his own to feed, no need to explain himself to anybody. But the herd had grown past what one man could watch through a season, and there was a stretch of fence on the east side that had needed mending since the fall before, and he was tired, in a way he hadn't let himself admit until a stranger was standing in front of him asking for work. Bunks in the lean-to, Cain said. Food's shared. I don't pay much, but I don't work a man to death either. Silas nodded like he'd expected a longer negotiation and was relieved not to need one. That's more than I had this morning. The boy was clumsy at first, clumsy with a shovel, clumsy reading the herd's moods, clumsy at the 1,000 small things Cain himself had only learned by getting them wrong. Cain recognized the clumsiness. He'd worn it himself 2 winters back, standing over a collapsed wall with cold coffee in his hand. So he taught the way the land had taught him, plainly, without much patience for questions that answered themselves if a man paid attention. Watch the cattle before you watch the sky, Cain told him one evening, the 2 of them leaning on the corral rail while a herd of 30 head shifted and turned, restless, though the sky overhead was clear. They'll tell you weather's coming before you can see it yourself, ears back, bunching tight, turning their tails to a wind you can't feel yet. Silas watched, frowning, trying to see what Cain saw. How do you know it's not just flies, or nothing? You don't, not the first few times. You get it wrong. Then you remember what wrong felt like, and next time you don't get it wrong again. Cain nodded toward the western sky, still clear, still giving nothing away to a man who didn't know how to look. Storm's coming by morning. Not tonight. Tomorrow, before noon. It came, as Cain said it would, a hard rain that turned to sleet by midday. Silas didn't ask again how Cain had known. He just started watching the herd himself, every evening after that, the way another man might read a newspaper. Cain showed him other things over that year and the next, how to cut sod so the blocks held their shape through a wet season, how to judge when the river was low enough to be safe to cross and when it only looked that way, how to splint a horse's leg with what was on hand instead of what a man wished he had. None of it came from a book. All of it came from a mistake Cain had already made, so Silas wouldn't have to make the same one blind. He never called it teaching. He'd have been embarrassed by the word. It was just work, done alongside somebody, with the reasons said out loud instead of kept silent. By the second year, the place had stopped feeling like a camp and started feeling like something closer to a home. Not because either man said so, but because of what they'd built into it without much discussion. The well came first, dug that second summer a stone's throw from the door, not because the river was too far, but because a man who'd once watched half his herd nearly buried in a whiteout didn't much care to walk to the water's edge every morning of a hard winter, guessing at ice that might or might not hold his weight. Cain and Silas took turns at it for the better part of 2 weeks, digging by hand until they struck water clean enough to drink without hauling it from the river at all. The garden came after, on Silas's suggestion more than Cain's. A patch of ground behind the house, turned over and worked through with manure from the corral until soil that had never grown anything but buffalo grass started to hold beans, potatoes, a few rows of corn that came up thin the first year and thicker the second, once they'd learned how much water the ground could actually hold before it ran straight through. It wasn't much. A well, a garden, cattle that no longer needed watching every hour of the day. But it meant, for the first time since Kane had cut the first block of sod 3 years before, that the two of them could go a full season without depending on a freight wagon or a passing trader for anything they truly needed. Kane hadn't set out to build something that could stand on its own. It had happened the way most useful things happened out here, one problem solved at a time, until one day a man looked around and realized the problems that used to keep him up at night simply weren't there anymore. He didn't know yet that the ground under all of it was about to become the most valuable stretch of dirt for 100 miles in any direction. It was Silas who noticed first the change nobody had announced. "More wagons than usual," he said one evening in the fall of 1874, watching a train of 6 pass on the trail below. "Later than most travelers like to be moving. That's the 3rd bunch this week." Kane had noticed too, though he hadn't said anything. Traffic on the trail had always ebbed and flowed with the seasons, but this felt different, steadier, thicker, less like travelers passing through and more like people arriving somewhere. Buffalo hunters spoke, when they stopped for water, of hide buyers setting up permanent stands further along the trail. A freighter mentioned, almost in passing, that there was talk of the railroad pushing further west than anyone had expected this soon. Kane had built his house to be left alone in. For 3 years, that was mostly what it had been: himself, then himself and Silas, the cattle, the river, the wind that never stopped. He hadn't asked for anything to change that. But standing at the well that evening, watching the last of the light catch the dust kicked up by wagons still moving an hour past when travelers usually made camp, Kane understood. The way he'd understood, once, that a storm was coming before he could see it, that something in the country around him was shifting, and no amount of preference on his part was going to slow it down. "You worried about it?" Silas asked, following his gaze. Kane considered the question honestly before he answered it. "Didn't build this place to have neighbors," he said finally. "Guess I'll find out if that matters." He went back inside without saying more. But he lay awake later than usual that night, listening to wagons still rolling somewhere out on the dark trail, and found himself thinking, for the first time since he dug the first shovel of sod 3 years before, that the land he'd claimed for himself might not stay his alone for very much longer. They came in the late summer of 1875, 4 men in a buggy that had no business on a trail built for freight wagons and cattle, polished boots, coats too heavy for the season, the kind of men who looked like they'd never once had to guess at weather from the way a herd turned its back to the wind. Kane was mending fence when he saw the buggy coming, and something in the unhurried way it moved down the trail told him this wasn't a family passing through or a trader looking to water stock. He set down the wire and waited. "Mr. Kane?" The man who spoke first climbed down without waiting for an answer, hand already extended. "Robert Ray. I represent a group of investors out of Leavenworth and Fort Riley, and right here at the fort for that matter. We're organizing a town company." Kane shook the offered hand because it seemed the thing to do, said nothing, and waited for the rest. "The railroad's coming," Ray went on, gesturing east, as though the tracks were already visible on the horizon, instead of still weeks or months out. "Everyone from here to Topeka knows it by now, and when it arrives, it's going to need a town to arrive at. This bend in the river," he nodded at the land around them, at Kane's house, at the well, the corral, the thin green rows of the garden. "This is the spot. Best water, best position on the trail, closest to the fort without sitting on Army land. We'd like to build here." Here meant, Kane understood without needing it spelled out further, the ground he was standing on. "This is my claim," Kane said. "Been working it 4 years." "We know." Ray's voice stayed easy, unbothered, the voice of a man who had made this exact conversation before and expected to make it again. "We're not here to take anything, Mr. Kane. We're here to buy what we can and plat the rest into lots, and we'd very much rather do that with your cooperation than without it. You'd keep grazing rights to whatever ground you held back, and you'd have first pick of any lot in the new town at founder's price if you wanted one." Kane didn't answer that day. He told Ray he'd think on it, and Ray, who seemed to have expected exactly that answer, said he'd return within the week, and rode off in his buggy with the other 3 men, trailing behind like men who had somewhere important to be and knew it. That night, Kane sat outside the house long after Silas had gone to sleep, looking at the dark shape of the corral, the well, the garden rose just visible by starlight. 4 years of mistakes corrected, of walls rebuilt lower and wider, of a boy taught to read weather in the shift of a herd's shoulders. 4 years of land that had asked nothing of him but to be paid attention to. He thought about refusing outright, telling Ray and his investors to find their town somewhere else, some other bend in some other river. But he'd freighted enough supplies out to the fort in his years there to know how railroads worked, how towns grew up around them, whether any one man wanted them to or not. He could refuse to sell. He couldn't stop the town from coming. The only real choice in front of him was what kind of neighbor he'd be to it once it arrived. "You going to sell?" Silas asked the next morning, working alongside him at the fence line, not quite looking at him when he asked it. "Not all of it." Kane didn't look up either. "Told him I'd think." "I've thought." "And?" "Town's coming whether I say yes or no. Difference is whether I've got a say in how it sits on my ground or whether some other man buys the claim out from under me, and I've got no say at all." He drove the next post in harder than it needed. "I'll sell the east parcel. Keep the house, the well, grazing land enough for the herd. Take the founder's lot, if it's offered honest." Silas was quiet a moment. "Feels like giving something up." "It is." Kane didn't pretend otherwise. "Man builds a thing alone, gets used to it being his alone. Doesn't mean it stays that way forever. Land didn't ask my permission before I got here either." Ray returned within the week, as promised, and the papers were signed on the porch of the sod house. The same porch Kane had built with his own hands 4 years before. The same ground that had swallowed a collapsed wall and given it back as lesson instead of loss. What came after happened faster than Kane had let himself expect. By the following spring, surveyors had platted streets where there had only been grass. Straight lines cutting across ground that had never known anything but the meandering paths cattle wore into it. Lumber arrived by wagon, since there was none to be had locally, and the first frame buildings went up within sight of Kane's own low sod walls. A general store, a stable, a saloon built from raw pine that still smelled of sap when the first customers walked through its door. The railroad reached the new town in the fall, exactly as Ray had promised it would, and after that the change came faster than fast, tents becoming buildings, buildings becoming a street becoming something a man might, without too much exaggeration, call a town. Kane watched it from his porch some evenings, Silas beside him, the two of them saying little. It was strange, watching strangers build within earshot of a house that had once stood alone for miles in every direction. Strange to hear voices at night that weren't his own or Silas's. Laughter from the saloon. Wagon wheels on streets that hadn't existed a year before. A blacksmith's hammer starting up most mornings before Kane had even finished his coffee. He didn't hate it. That surprised him some. He'd built this place to be left alone in, and here it was, less alone than it had ever been, and still, somehow, still his. It was Silas who left first, not Kane. "There's a fella starting up his own spread west of here," Silas said one evening, 2 years after the town had taken root, the two of them mending the same stretch of fence they'd mended together on the day he'd first arrived. Offered me a share if I'll run it with him.
Real wages. My own herd, eventually.
Cain kept working the wire. Didn't look up right away. You asking my permission? No. Silas almost smiled. Just telling you before I go. Good. Cain finally looked at him. A man who needs permission to build his own place hasn't learned much from me at all. They didn't make more of the goodbye than it needed to be. A handshake, a few words about which mistakes were worth making twice, and which weren't. Silas rode west 3 days later with little more than what he'd arrived with 5 years before, though he sat a horse now like a man who belonged on one, and knew weather the way Cain had once tried, badly, to teach him. Cain stood at the well and watched him go until the trail took him out of sight, and then he went back to work, because the herd still needed watching and the fence still needed mending, whether or not there was somebody beside him to do it with. The house felt quieter after that. Not empty. The town's noise still drifted up most evenings, wagons and hammers and voices that weren't his. Just quieter, in the particular way a place feels when somebody who once filled it has gone on to fill somewhere else. She came to town the way most people did those years, by rail, with her father, a merchant named Thomas Harlow, who set up a dry goods store on the street that had, only 3 years before, been nothing but grass. Cain noticed her the way a man notices anything new in a place he'd watched change slowly for years, not all at once, but gradually, the way weather builds before a man admits a storm is coming. She kept her father's ledgers, weighed out flour and nails with the same steady hands, and didn't flinch the first time Cain came in trailing mud from a fence line and forgot to take his hat off indoors. "You always this quiet?" she asked him, the 3rd or 4th time he'd come through the door. "Or is it just around people you don't know yet?" "Bit of both," Cain admitted. It was the most he'd said to anyone since Silas rode west. She didn't press him for more that day. That, more than anything else, was what he noticed. It wasn't courtship in any way Cain would have recognized the word. There was no sudden turn, no single moment either of them could have pointed to later and called the beginning. It built the way the well had built, the way the garden had. One small thing added to another, over enough seasons that a man looked up one day and found something whole where there had only been separate pieces before. He brought her father cattle for the store's trade. She kept his accounts straight without ever shorting him, the way some in town had learned to do with men who kept to themselves and didn't check their figures too closely. He walked her home past the saloon once, when a group of drovers got loud enough to worry her father, and said little the whole way, and she didn't seem to mind the quiet any more than she'd minded it the first day in the store. "You don't talk much," she said again, a year into knowing him, "but you notice everything. I've watched you do it. You knew it was going to rain last Tuesday before anyone else in town had an opinion on the matter. Land taught me that. Wasn't born knowing it." "I know." She looked at him a moment, something settling behind her eyes. "That's the part I trust. Not men who are born knowing things. Men who learn them the hard way and remember how." He asked her to marry him that autumn, standing by the well he and Silas had dug 6 years before, with none of the ceremony a man back east might have thought the moment deserved. She said yes, with about the same amount of ceremony, which suited them both. They married in the spring of 1878 in the town's new church, built of proper lumber now, with a bell that could be heard clear out to Cain's fence line, and Eleanor moved into the sod house that had once stood entirely alone on that stretch of the Arkansas. The years that followed didn't make for much of a story, and Cain would have said that was exactly as it should be. The herd grew, the town grew faster. Eleanor kept her father's books until her father passed, and then kept the store itself for a time, before handing it to a younger cousin who'd come out from the east looking for the same kind of chance Cain had once found on this ground. The sod house stayed standing long after most of the town had gone to proper lumber and brick. Cain never saw much reason to replace walls that had already proven themselves against every winter the country had thrown at them. He added a room eventually when Eleanor asked for one, but the original three, the ones he'd built wrong the first time and right the second, stayed exactly as they were. He grew older the way the town grew up around him, gradually, without much fuss, the changes only visible if a man stopped to compare one year against another.
The buffalo hunters stopped coming, then the great cattle herds too, as the railroad pushed the trade further along and quarantine lines shifted the drives elsewhere. The saloon that had once been the loudest building in town gave way over the decades to banks and hardware stores and a schoolhouse where the corral had once stood. He never spoke much about the early years, even when townsfolk, and eventually their children, asked him about the days before there'd been a town at all. When he did speak of it, it was never as though it had been hard, though everyone who'd lived through a Kansas winter knew well enough what he wasn't saying. "You built the first house here," a young man asked him once, decades on, in the way people ask questions they already know the answer to, just to hear it confirmed. Before any of this. "Somebody had to be first," Cain said. "Didn't mean to be, just needed a place to keep cattle out of the wind." Jonas Cain died in the winter of 1917 in the same house he had built with his own hands nearly 50 years before. 3 rooms that had once stood entirely alone on an empty stretch of the Arkansas, now surrounded on every side by a town that had grown up around them without ever quite managing to make him leave. He was 80 years old. Eleanor had gone ahead of him some years before. The house, by then, sat in the middle of streets that had been grass when he'd first walked them, among buildings raised by people who had never known the land the way he'd known it, the way weather moved before a storm showed itself, the way cattle turned their backs to a wind no man could feel yet, the way a wall built too fast would always come down, and a wall built with patience never would. The town turned out for his funeral, not because he had ever asked for their notice, but because somewhere along the 50 years since he'd cut that first block of sod, his name had become part of the ground the town stood on, whether he'd meant it to or not. He was not a gunslinger. He had never worn a badge, never chased down an outlaw, never done anything that would have made for a dime novel back east. He had simply been the first man to stay, and stayed long enough that the town forgot, mostly, that there had ever been a time before him. The story of Jonas Cain is a work of fiction. It was inspired by the life of a real man, Henry L. Sittler, who in 1871 built a 3-room sod house on the bank of the Arkansas River, 5 miles west of Fort Dodge, Kansas. That house became the first structure on what would soon be platted as Dodge City. In August of 1872, a group of businessmen organized the Dodge City Town Company and began developing the town site around it. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad arrived that September, and within a few short years, the settlement grew from a single sod house into one of the most famous cattle towns of the American West, known in its time as the cow capital of the world. The real Henry Sittler lived out the rest of his life in Dodge City. He married in 1875, worked in freighting, contracting, and later the cattle trade, and became a stockholder in the town's first bank. He died in 1917, remembered as one of the town's most respected early settlers, not for any single dramatic act, but simply for having been the first to stay. Every character and event beyond that basic historical framework, including Cain's specific experiences, his relationships, and the people around him, is fictional, imagined in the spirit of the man who came before there was a town at all. If Jonas Cain's story is the kind you come here for, no myths, no easy endings, just the people who stayed long enough to find out what held, there's more waiting for you. Subscribe to Wild West Life
and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. We post a new story every week, each one a little different, all of them true to the same idea. The frontier wasn't built by legends. It was built by people who showed up, made mistakes, and kept going anyway.
If you enjoyed this one, let us know in the comments. We read every one, and they help us know which stories are worth telling next. Thanks for staying till the end. We'll see you in the next one.